The sealed door opens with a
It's
sound like a
time
held
to
breath finally
go.
released.
I know.
Beyond it,
Be
warm air rises
safe.
from stone. Sarah Brennan stands at the threshold,
Careful now.
lantern,
The
raised her
steps are
sister Emma,
uneven.
already 2
I
steps down the narrow
see.
staircase that
It's
neither of
so
them knew
dark
existed
down
until 20
here.
minutes ago. The
Stay
house above them is
close.
cold. April cold, the kind that settles
This
into mountain
passage
hollows
here, it
and stays there
speaks
until
of
June decides
renewal.
otherwise. Down here,
Yes,
the
I
air moves
see it
differently, carries
now. A
warmth that
beautiful
has no business
thought.
existing in a place that has been sealed for more than a decade.
The
4 months
seedlings are
earlier, Dry Creek
thriving.
buried
We
2 men in the
must be
same frozen
gentle.
week. The preacher said
Yes,
the
they
Lord
are
provides
so
his breath, forming
delicate.
clouds in the
I'll
chapel
water
there.
them
The
carefully.
neighbors brought
Good.
peace and said to be
This
patient, said
map
time heals,
shows the
said all
old
the things
route,
people say when they do
but
not
the
know what else to
terrain has
offer.
changed
Sarah
since
Brennan listened
then.
to all of it,
We must
hands folded in
find
her lap,
another
and nodded the way a
way.
woman does when she is holding herself together by sheer force of will. Emma sat beside her, crying openly, not caring who saw. Different approaches to the same unbearable weight. Daniel and Thomas brothers, who married sisters, gone in a mining accident that took 6 men total and left Dry Creek stunned into a silence that lasted weeks. The suggestions came later, after the immediate shock wore off, and the town remembered it had opinions about how widows should conduct themselves. A brother-in-law in Denver who ran a boarding house and could use help in the kitchen. A distant cousin in Missouri who wrote letters about teaching positions at a school for girls. A widow's position at the dry goods store, sweeping and stocking, which would keep them comfortable enough if they were careful and did not take up much space. Each suggestion arrived wrapped in concern, delivered with the unspoken message that 2 women alone were a problem requiring solution. Sarah declined everything with a closed mouth and a level gaze. Emma declined with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. They sat in the small house they had shared with their husbands and looked at the numbers in Sarah's ledger. $147 between them and whatever came next. The house was not theirs, just rented. The furniture was not worth selling. Their options narrowed to a point so fine it could draw blood. Emma heard about the Briar Ridge property from old Clem Aldridge at the feed store. He mentioned it casually, the way people mention things they assume no one will take seriously. A house that had stood empty for 11 years up in the high country where the road was more suggestion than fact. The county would let it go to anyone willing to pay the back taxes and not complain about the state of things. Sarah asked how much. Clem named a figure that made Emma's eyes widen. Sarah wrote it down in her ledger, did not speak for 3 days, then said they would go look at it. The wagon track up to Briar Ridge earned its reputation. More erosion than engineering, threading through spruce and loose shale until the house appeared around a long bend, like something emerging from a fever dream. Sarah stopped the mule. Emma climbed down without waiting, walked straight toward the structure as if forward motion alone could make it less daunting. One porch post leaned at an angle that suggested imminent surrender. 2 windows wore cracks like spiderwebs. The chimney cap was missing entirely. Frost-heaved boards ran along the south wall in a rippled wave, the house itself seeming to flinch from some long-past cold. Emma stood in front of the door, her hand on the frame. "It has good bones," she said. Sarah remained on the wagon seat, studying the whole mess with the eye of someone trained by necessity to see problems before they became disasters. "It has bones," she agreed. Whether they were good bones remained to be determined. The first night they slept in their coats. The stove in the kitchen drew poorly and filled the room with thin smoke until Sarah found a broken tile in the flue and plugged it with a strip of tin she cut from an old pail Daniel had used for fishing tackle. After that, the fire caught properly, and they ate salt pork and cold biscuits by its light while the wind pressed against the cracked windows with the persistence of something that knew it would eventually get in. Emma was cheerful, which Sarah found both exhausting and necessary in equal measure. "The bones are good," Emma said again. Sarah looked at her over the makeshift plate they were sharing. "You are going to keep saying that, not until it stops being true. It might never stop being true. Then you have your answer." In the days that followed, the house revealed itself in layers. The warped cellar door that would not close without forcing. The collapsed section of fencing along the north field where something deer or weather had pushed through and never been repaired. The well that was sound but needed its cover rebuilt before the spring melt sent debris cascading down from higher elevations. Each discovery landed in one of two piles. The pile that meant we can manage this, and the pile that meant maybe we made a mistake coming here. Sarah kept a list in her ledger because naming a thing made it smaller, more manageable. Cracked north window, warped cellar door, missing chimney cap, porch post, south wall boards. Each item a decision waiting to be made. Emma did not keep lists. She walked every room twice a day running her hands along walls, opening cabinets that had not been opened in years, testing floorboards with her boot heel. She said she was learning the house, which Sarah understood to mean she was deciding whether to love it. The answer Sarah suspected was already yes. Her own answer came on the eighth morning when she stood at the kitchen window before dawn and watched light arrive over the ridge in a slow wash of gold and pale pink. For the first time since December, she felt as if she was standing exactly where she belonged. They began in earnest on a Monday. Sarah took the stove, the windows, and the structural accounting of the porch. Emma took the interior rooms, the fencing plan, and the kitchen shelving, which had warped badly and needed to come down before new boards could go up. It was while Emma was pulling the last section of shelving away from the pantry wall that the back panel came loose with it. She stopped pry bar still in her hand and found herself looking at old wood and plaster that did not match anything else in the room. She put down her tools. Sarah. Something in her voice made Sarah come quickly from where she had been working on the porch steps. Emma stood in the pantry, one hand pressed flat against the wall, the other pointing at the seam she had uncovered. The wall here is different. Sarah stepped closer, running her own hand along the edge. Not just different. Built to look the same, but not quite managing it. They looked at each other with the identical gray eyes they had been looking at each other with since birth, a whole conversation happening in silence. Then Emma picked up her pry bar again and started working the seam. The panel came away in pieces, old plaster crumbling, revealing a door. Not a large door, just tall enough to walk through if you did not mind ducking slightly. The wood was thick, darker than anything else in the house, and it had no handle on this side. Just a smooth surface and hinges set deep into the frame. Sarah touched it, felt the solid weight of it. Emma was already looking for a way to open it. There. A small depression in the frame barely visible. Emma pressed her fingers into it, and something inside the wall clicked. The door swung inward on hinges that moved smoothly despite their age, opening onto darkness in a set of stone steps leading down. Sarah went back for the lantern. Emma waited at the top of the stairs, barely, her whole body leaning forward like a hound on a scent. When Sarah returned with the light, they stood together at the threshold. The air coming up from below was warm noticeably, so carrying a smell of stone and water. Sarah held the lantern higher. 8 steps she counted, all stone worn smooth at the center from old use. She went first because that was how it had always been between them. Emma followed close enough that her breath touched Sarah's shoulder. The chamber below was roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet across, with a ceiling that arched just high enough to stand under without ducking. The walls were fitted stone dry and close-fitted, the work of someone who knew precisely what they were doing. At the far end, water moved. Not much, just a trickle that emerged from a seam in the rock and ran along a narrow channel cut into the floor before disappearing into the opposite wall. The sound of it filled the space, a quiet murmur that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The air was warm, genuinely warm, perhaps 10 degrees warmer than the kitchen above. Sarah lifted the lantern toward the shelves that lined 3 walls floor, almost to ceiling built from pine planks that had aged to deep amber. On the shelves sat jars, dozens of them, perhaps more, sealed with wax, each one labeled in a small, careful hand. She moved closer, reading. Mortgage lifter tomato, speckled cranberry bean, glass gem corn, purple Vienna kohlrabi, lazy wife pole bean, lemon queen sunflower. The labels continued in rows beyond what the lantern could reach from where they stood. Emma moved to the nearest shelf and lifted a jar of bean seeds. She turned it slowly, watching the dark speckled seeds shift inside. The wax seal was intact. The glass was perfectly clear. "How long have these been here? 11 years at least," Sarah said. "If the house has stood empty since 77, she moved down the nearest shelf, reading labels. Perhaps longer. Some of these varieties I have never seen written down anywhere." On the lowest shelf of the far wall, away from the seeds, they found the journals. Three of them thick and bound in brown calfskin, written in the same small, careful hand as the labels. Sarah carried them upstairs to the kitchen table, while Emma went back down twice more just to stand in the warmth and look at the jars in better light. When she finally came up, Sarah had the first journal open, reading by lamplight, even though it was barely past noon. The mountain made its own weather, and today it had decided on gray. The journals belonged to a man named Aldous Crane. He had built the house in 1861, come west from Pennsylvania with a wife named Harriet, and a plan that read in his own words as a life built on growing things in a place people said nothing would grow. The first journal was personal. The building of the house, the early failures of the garden, Harriet's notes in the margins, correcting his spelling, and adding her own observations about which plants took and which did not. Her handwriting was smaller than his, neater with a precision that suggested patience he clearly did not always possess. The second journal was more technical. Crane had studied the spring beneath the house for years and had come to understand that its warmth was constant regardless of season. 54 degrees at all times, he wrote enough to keep the chamber frost-free through the hardest Colorado winter. He had drawn plans for what he called a glass growing room, a structure to be built above the south-facing slope fed by warmth drawn up from the spring chamber through a system of clay pipes embedded in the floor. The drawings were detailed, measured, annotated with calculations and corrections, the work of a man who intended to build something that would last. The third journal was unfinished. In it, Crane had begun writing instructions step by step, careful as if writing for someone who would come after him. The final entry was dated October 9th, 1877, and read, "The room is nearly ready. Harriet says we will plant the first beds by spring. I will finish these notes when..." It stopped there. Sarah read it twice. Emma read it once and then sat looking at the window for a long while. "He meant for someone to find it," Emma said at last. "He meant for Harriet to find it," Sarah said carefully. "But Harriet did not." Emma turned back to the journal, smoothed the last page with her fingers. So it waited. Sarah looked at the cheer of glass-gemmed corn sitting on the table between them, seeds gleaming like polished stone through the clear glass. 11 years, she said. "Long enough," Emma replied. They started with the chamber. Sarah's approach was methodical, which surprised no one who had ever watched her work. She spent the first full day doing nothing but measuring and recording. The dimensions of the room, the temperature at the floor and at the ceiling, the flow rate of the spring timed with the Daniel's old pocket watch that she still carried. The position of the channel, its depth, the way the water disappeared into the far wall. She filled 4 pages of her ledger with numbers and sketches before she was satisfied she understood what she was working with. Emma spent that same day in the journals reading Crane's notes from the beginning, marking pages with strips of torn cloth. She read with a pencil in her hand, adding small annotations in the margins. Questions mostly, and a few observations that built on what Crane had recorded. By evening, she had a list of her own organized, not by task, but by wonder. "Things I did not know were possible," she had written at the top. Below it, a dozen entries about heat retention and seed preservation and the precise angle at which winter light would enter a south-facing glass structure at this elevation. On the second day, they tested the seeds. Emma had read enough about seed keeping to know that age did not necessarily mean failure. Temperature, moisture, light, these were the factors that mattered. Crane had controlled all of them. She chose 12 jars representing different families: tomatoes, beans, corn, squash, brassicas. She planted a small sample from each in shallow dishes of soil set near the spring channel where the warmth was most consistent. Sarah built a rough plank shelf along the channel to hold the dishes level. The work went quickly, her hands moving with the kind of efficiency that came from years of making do with what was available. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at the 12 dishes lined up like small gardens, waiting to prove themselves. If even half of these grow, she said. Emma nodded. Then we will know Crane was not just hopeful, he was right. They checked the dishes each morning before anything else. On the sixth day, the first shoots emerged. Pale green, tentative, barely visible unless you were looking for them. Emma called Sarah to come see, and Sarah, who was not by nature a woman given to exclamation, said, "Oh," in a quiet voice, and stood looking for some time. By the 10th day, 11 of the 12 varieties had germinated. Only the kohlrabi remained dormant, and even that showed signs of swelling in the seed coat that suggested it was simply slower, not dead. 11-year-old seeds, Sarah said more to herself than to Emma. Crane knew how to store them, Emma replied. The temperature, the dark, the dry. He was careful. He was extraordinary, Sarah said. Emma smiled at the word. Sarah did not use it often, saved it for things that genuinely merited the weight of it. This merited it. Building the glass growing room required more planning than either of them had immediately available. So they began with what they could manage, clearing the south slope of the house, pulling volunteer scrub in old dead growth, leveling the ground. Crane's designs called for a foundation of fitted stone with clay pipe channels running beneath the floor connected to the spring chamber through a short horizontal passage he had already excavated but never fully finished. Sarah spent 3 full days clearing and extending that passage, working with a short-handled pick and a bucket emerging each evening, with her hair gray with stone dust and her back singing a long note of complaint she refused to acknowledge out loud. Emma worked above sorting and cataloging the seeds, cross-referencing Crane's planting notes with his germination records, building a picture of what had succeeded in this particular mountain hollow and what had not. She was making a plan, not just a garden plan, but a year plan, a full season picture of what the room and the slope together could produce if everything went as hoped. When she finished, she had a hand-drawn map carefully lettered with planting dates and projected yields and a column of notes on each variety's particular needs. She presented it to Sarah one evening over supper. Sarah studied it for a long time, turning the paper to catch the lamplight better. "Where did you learn to do this? From Crane?" Emma said simply. "He was a very good teacher." Sarah turned the map over, looking at the south slope layout. "If the glass room works as designed, it will work," Emma interrupted. "Crane tested the heat transfer for 4 winters before he built a single wall. The numbers are in the second journal." Sarah looked at her over the paper. "You are very certain." "I am certain about the thing Crane was certain about," Emma said. "He was not a man who guessed." Sarah turned the map back over and looked at the planting calendar. Her finger traced the column for February, the dead of a mountain winter, when everything outside would be frozen and still. The column was full. Tomatoes, beans, lettuce, radishes. As if winter did not exist, as if the calendar itself could be rewritten by warmth and glass, and Crane's careful understanding of what was possible. She looked up at Emma. "Then we had better finish that passage." The glass room went up in the 3rd week of May. It took them longer than Sarah had initially calculated, but her calculations had not accounted for the difficulty of working with salvaged materials. Every board measured and cut by Sarah, each one assessed for strength and straightness before it was allowed into the structure. Every pane of salvaged window glass set and sealed by Emma, who had steadier hands for detail work and more patience for the small adjustments that made the difference between a seal that would hold and one that would fail the first time the wind came from the north. They built it low against the south wall, its pitched roof angled to catch maximum light, its floor crossed with the clay pipe channels Crane had laid out in his plans. The pipes were already in place, buried in the passage Sarah had cleared, waiting to be connected. Crane had done most of this work himself years ago, laying the groundwork for a project he would never see completed. Sarah connected the final sections, sealed the joints with a mixture of lime and river clay she made following Crane's notes, and sat back on her heels in the warm dimness of the passage. Thank you, she thought to no one she could name. Then she went upstairs and told Emma the system was ready. The day they fired the first real heat through the pipes, they did not speak much. Emma stood in the center of the glass room with her hand on the floor, feeling the warmth rise through the boards. Sarah crouched near the north corner, checking for leaks in the pipe joints, finding none. The temperature climbed slowly, steadily, until the room held a warmth that had nothing to do with the pale May sunlight coming through the glass and everything to do with the spring running beneath their feet. They sat on the unfinished floor together, backs against the south wall, and let it be real. Emma closed her eyes. Sarah kept hers open, watching the light move across the empty beds they had built along the east and west walls. This is going to work, Emma said. Sarah did not answer right away. When she did, her voice was quiet. It already is. It was a neighbor who first saw the glass glinting on the south slope. Hester Pruitt ran a homestead 3 miles down the ridge with her son Wally, who was 14 and inclined to wander. Wally had spotted the structure from a high point above the tree line while looking for a goat that had decided fences were suggestions, and he had come home with a description that made his mother set down her mending and look at him twice. A whole glass room big as a parlor, Wally said. Maybe bigger. Hester Pruitt was a practical woman, not given to unnecessary concern, but she had lived long enough on Briar Ridge to know that unusual things required accounting for. She rode up the following Saturday with a jar of preserves and a look on her face that was politely curious and more directly assessing. Emma met her at the door with coffee and showed her around without hesitation, which seemed to throw Hester briefly off whatever plans she had arrived with. Sarah watched from the doorway as Emma walked their neighbor through the glass room, explaining the clay pipe channels in the floor, the seeds already growing in the south-facing beds, the warmth that pressed at you like a gentle hand when you stepped inside, even on a cool morning. Hester asked careful questions and received careful answers. She poked a finger into the soil of the nearest bed, felt the warmth at the roots, and was quiet for a moment. This heat is from below, she said. From the spring, Emma confirmed. It runs under the house, constant 54 degrees, summer and winter. Hester looked at her. You are saying this room will grow through winter. That is what we are saying, Emma said pleasantly. What Hester said when she got back to town, Sarah heard about secondhand through Clem Aldridge, who heard it from the postmaster's wife. It was not unkind exactly, but it carried an edge of doubt wrapped in a casing of concern. Two women alone up there building things they did not know would hold. Getting ahead of themselves, probably. The kind of talk that started gently and had the potential to harden into something less gentle if it went unchecked. By the time it reached Sarah on a supply run in late May, it had acquired details she recognized as invented. They had spent foolishly on the glass, apparently. They had dug up the whole floor of the house, apparently. They were planning to sell produce in town, apparently, which was going to be a problem for Vernon Cass, who ran the only vegetable supply into Dry Creek and had opinions about competition. Sarah drove home in a silence that Emma read correctly the moment she saw her face. What are they saying? That we have overreached? Emma was quiet for a moment. Have we, Sarah, thought about this honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things? The structure was sound. The pipes held heat. The seeds had germinated at a rate Crane himself had not quite achieved in his notes, though. Whether that was because the seeds had been stored even better than he knew, or because the spring ran a degree warmer than in his time, was impossible to say. The money was tight, but not broken. There was no element of the plan she could examine and call a mistake. No, she said. Emma nodded once, as if that settled it. Then let them say it, eh? The evening of the 1st of June, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her ledger open, adding numbers that did not want to add the way she needed them to. They had $62 remaining. The house needed repairs that could not wait much longer. The chimney cap, the north window, the porch post that leaned at an angle suggesting it had given up on the concept of verticality entirely. Each repair had a cost, and the costs were eating into the small reserve she had tried to maintain for emergencies. Emma came in from the glass room with dirt on her hands and hope on her face. "The tomatoes are setting fruit already," she said. Sarah looked up from the ledger. "How many plants?" 12. Emma sat down across from her, saw the numbers, saw Sarah's expression. "We are going to be fine. We are going to be careful," Sarah corrected. "We are going to be both." Emma agreed. The letter arrived on the 8th of June, delivered by a county rider who did not stay for coffee. Sarah opened it, standing in the kitchen, read it twice, then handed it to Emma without speaking. The county had reassessed the property value based on improvements made to the structure. The back taxes, originally calculated at $280, had been adjusted to $340. The deadline for payment remained November 1st. Failure to pay would result in forfeiture of the property and all improvements thereto. Emma set the letter down on the table. "We have $62. Sarah sat down slowly. "In 4.5 months. They looked at each other across the table, identical faces showing identical calculations. $278 in 4.5 months. "That is, I know what it is," Sarah said. Emma stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the glass room gleaming in the afternoon light. "The tomatoes will fruit in July. We can sell them." "To whom?" Sarah asked, not unkindly. "Vernon Cass controls every vegetable that comes into Dry Creek. He buys from Denver and sells here at 3 times cost. If we undercut him, we will have a problem," Sarah finished. Emma turned from the window. "Then we need him not to see us as competition." The idea came to Emma over the next 2 days, the way ideas often came to her in pieces that assembled themselves while she worked. By the third day, she had it whole. She explained it to Sarah over breakfast. "We do not sell to the town. We sell to someone who needs something the town cannot provide." Like what Sarah asked. Like fresh tomatoes in October. Sarah set down her coffee. "October tomatoes do not exist. They do in a glass room heated by a spring that does not know what season is," Emma said. Sarah was quiet, thinking. "You want to find someone who will pay for something impossible." "I want to find someone who will pay for something Crane made possible," Emma corrected. "There is a difference." By mid-June, the glass room had become its own small ecosystem. The tomato plants climbed the stakes Emma had driven into the beds, their leaves dark green and vigorous. The bean plants wound up the cane trellis she had built along the back wall. Lettuce filled the north bed in tight green rows. Sarah checked the temperature twice a day, recording it in her ledger alongside notes about growth rates and soil moisture. The room held steady at 68 degrees. When the sun was on, it dropped to 62 at night. Warm enough to grow, cool enough not to cook. Emma spent her mornings in the room, her afternoons in Crane's journals, cross-referencing what she was seeing with what he had predicted. His notes were proving themselves accurate in ways that made her want to find his grave just to tell him so. Every projection, every calculation, every careful observation about which varieties would thrive in this particular balance of warmth and light was playing out exactly as he had said it would. The man had been right about everything, and he had died before he could see it proven. On the 19th of June, a Wednesday, Hester Pruitt came back. This time she brought Wally, who stood in the glass room and did not speak for a long moment, just looked at the tomato plants that were already knee-high and setting fruit. "It really does feel like July in here," he said finally. "Even in February," Emma replied. Wally looked at her. "Even in February." "Come back in February," Emma said, "and I will show you tomatoes." Hester caught Sarah's eye, a question in her look. Sarah gave a small nod. Emma was not given to exaggeration. Hester stayed for coffee, asked practical questions, received practical answers. When she left, she paused at the door. "You should know Vernon Cass is asking questions about what you are doing up here." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest he is worried about his vegetable supply," Hester said. "I thought you should know." She looked at Emma. "If you do grow tomatoes in February, there are people who would want them. I might know some of those people if you are interested." After she left, Sarah and Emma sat on the porch in the evening cool. The ridge was going amber and rust above the tree line, the light thick and golden, the way it got in late June when summer was deciding whether to commit. "We are going to have a problem with Cass," Sarah said. "We are going to have tomatoes in October," Emma replied. "That does not solve the problem." "It might," Emma said, "if we make the problem irrelevant." Vernon Cass arrived on the 23rd of June unannounced, riding a bay mare that looked too small for him. He was a large man, red-faced and breathing hard by the time he dismounted his good hat, already dark with sweat, despite the morning being relatively cool. Sarah met him at the porch steps, did not invite him up. Emma appeared in the doorway behind her, wiping her hands on her apron, her face carefully neutral. Cass removed his hat, held it against his chest in a gesture that might have been respectful if his eyes had not been cataloging everything they could see. "Heard you ladies have been doing some building up here." Sarah waited. Cass shifted his weight. "A glass room, I heard, for growing. That is correct." Cass looked past her toward the south slope where sunlight caught the glass and threw it back in sharp lines. "That is quite an undertaking for two women alone." "We manage," Sarah replied. Her voice was level, giving nothing. Cass put his hat back on, resettled it carefully. "The thing is, I supply all the vegetables that come into Dry Creek. Have for 12 years. Buy them in Denver. Bring them up twice a week. It is a service people have come to rely on." Sarah felt Emma shift in the doorway behind her, but did not turn. "We are not planning to compete with your business, Mr. Cass." Cass's expression eased slightly, though his eyes remained sharp. "Well, now that is good to hear, because I was thinking if you ladies do manage to grow anything in that room of yours, I would be happy to buy it. Fair price, regular arrangement. Keep things simple for everyone." Emma's voice came from the doorway, pleasant and clear. "What price would you consider fair, Mr. Cass?" Cass turned his attention to her, seemed to be recalculating something. "Depends on the quality and the quantity, but I am a reasonable man. 50 cents a pound for tomatoes, maybe a bit more for beans if they are good." Emma's smile did not waver. "That is generous of you to offer. We will certainly keep it in mind." After he left, Sarah stood on the porch watching the dust settle back onto the track. 50 cents a pound. Emma came to stand beside her. "He buys in Denver for 30 cents and sells here for $1.50. So he wants to take our tomatoes, pay us less than wholesale, and maintain his profit margin." "Exactly." Sarah turned to look at her sister. "What are you thinking?" Emma's eyes were on the glass room, bright in the noon sun. "I am thinking we need to find someone who understands what October tomatoes are actually worth." July arrived with heat that surprised even the locals who thought they knew what summer meant at this elevation. The glass room became an oven during the peak hours, and Sarah rigged a canvas shade that could be drawn across the south-facing panes when the temperature inside climbed above 80. Emma watered twice a day, morning and evening, using buckets hauled from the well, until Sarah built a simple gravity feed system that drew from a barrel she kept filled on the north side of the house. The tomatoes ripened in waves. First, the early variety, small fruits that went from green to red in what seemed like days. Then the larger ones, the mortgage lifters, heavy fruits that pulled the vines down despite the staking. Emma picked them carefully, set them in shallow baskets lined with a cloth. By the middle of the month, they had more tomatoes than two women could possibly eat, and the plants showed no sign of slowing. Sarah sat at the kitchen table on the evening of the 15th, her ledger open, doing arithmetic that refused to cooperate. They had spent $89 on materials for the glass room and repairs to the house. They had $62 at the start of the month. They had $58 now after food and the inevitable small expenses that accumulated despite her best efforts. They needed $340 by November 1st. The numbers did not work unless the tomatoes worked, and the tomatoes would not work if Vernon Cass was their only buyer. Emma came in from the glass room with a basket of beans, set them on the counter, and saw Sarah's face. "We will find a way." Sarah looked up from the ledger. With what hope? Emma pulled out a chair, sat down. "With Hester. She said she knew people." Sarah closed the ledger, rubbed her eyes. "She said she might know people. That is not the same thing. Then we make it the same thing, Emma replied. Tomorrow I am taking tomatoes to Hester. She can introduce us to whoever she was talking about, or she can tell us straight that she was just being kind. Either way, we will know. Hester's place was 3 miles down the ridge, a smaller operation than Briar Ridge, but better maintained. The house had a fresh coat of whitewash. The barn was plumb, and the garden out front showed the kind of attention that came from someone who knew what they were doing. Hester came out when she heard the wagon Wally trailing behind her with a piece of leather he was working into something that might eventually be a bridle. Emma climbed down with her basket. I brought you something. Hester lifted the claw, saw the tomatoes underneath their skins, still warm from the morning sun. Emma, these are beautiful. They are also numerous, Emma said. We have more than we can use, and I remembered you said you might know people who would want them. Hester looked at the tomatoes, then at Emma, then back at the tomatoes. I might have spoken hastily. Or you might have meant it, Emma said gently. Either way, I would appreciate knowing which. Hester was quiet for a moment, her fingers resting on one of the tomatoes. There is a man named Frank Holloway. He is the head chef at the Mountain View Hotel in Leadville. Comes through Dry Creek once a month buying supplies. Last time he was here, he was complaining about the quality of the produce he gets shipped in from Denver. Said he would pay good money for anything fresh and local. Emma felt something shift in her chest, careful not to let it show on her face. When is he due back? End of the month, Hester said. I could send word if you want. Have him come up to your place instead of dealing through Cass. Emma set the basket down on Hester's porch. I would appreciate that very much. Hester nodded, picked up the basket. Wally, go get me some paper and a pencil. The boy disappeared into the house. Hester looked at Emma. You should know Holloway's particular. If he says he wants something, he means it, but he also means he wants it done right. No bruised fruit, no late deliveries, no excuses. Can you manage that? Emma thought of Sarah's methodical approach to everything, the way she measured twice before cutting, once the way she kept lists and checked them and kept them accurate. Yes, she said, we can manage that. Frank Holloway arrived at Briar Ridge on the morning of July 30th, driving a wagon pulled by a matched pair of grays that looked too fine for the rough track. He was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe 40, with the kind of lean build that came from working in hot kitchens and forgetting to eat. He climbed down from the wagon seat, looked at the glass room, and did not speak for a moment. Hester said you were growing tomatoes in July. We are, Emma confirmed. She gestured toward the glass room. Would you like to see inside? Holloway walked between the beds, his eyes taking in the plants heavy with fruit, the beans climbing their trellis, the lettuce still producing despite the heat. He bent down, examined a tomato still on the vine, pressed his thumb gently against the skin to test firmness. How many plants do you have? 12 tomatoes, 6 beans, Emma said. The tomatoes are producing about 30 pounds a week right now. Holloway straightened, turned to look at her. What variety? Mortgage lifter mostly. Some Cherokee purple. He nodded slowly. And you can maintain this through winter. Sarah spoke from the doorway. The room is heated by a spring that runs beneath the house. Constant temperature regardless of season. The system was designed by the original owner in the 1870s, never completed until now. We have been testing it since May, and the plants show no sign of stress. Holloway walked to the north wall, touched the glass, felt the warmth radiating from the floor. In February, you will have tomatoes. That is the plan. He turned back to them. I will pay $1.50 a pound for tomatoes, $2 for beans. I need 30 pounds a week, minimum 50 preferred. Can you do that? Emma looked at Sarah. Sarah did arithmetic in her head fast. The 12 plants were already producing close to 30 pounds. By August, they would be at full production, easily 40 or 50 pounds a week. Yes, she said, we can do that. Holloway pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket, wrote something. I will send a wagon every Saturday starting in September. Payment on delivery cash. He tore out the page, handed it to Sarah. That is my signature in the terms. If the quality drops or the quantity falls short, the arrangement ends. Understood. Sarah took the paper, read it carefully. Understood. After he left, Emma sat on the porch steps and did her own arithmetic. 50 pounds a week at $1.50 for tomatoes alone was $75. Times 8 weeks until November was $600. More than enough to pay the taxes with room to spare. Sarah sat beside her. That assumes everything continues exactly as it is. The plants do not fail. The weather cooperates, the pipes do not break, and Frank Holloway does not change his mind. Emma leaned against her sister's shoulder. You are determined to find the problem in this. I am determined not to be surprised by it, Sarah corrected. August brought its own challenges, though none of them were the ones Sarah had been bracing for. The tomato plants continued to produce at a rate that seemed almost aggressive, as if they had been waiting 11 years for someone to give them permission to grow and were making up for lost time. The beans climbed past the top of their trellis and had to be trained sideways along wires Emma strung near the roofline. Sarah harvested and packed, checked temperatures and flow rates, made notes in her ledger about what worked and what needed adjustment. The loneliness found them in the evenings the way it always had, the way Sarah suspected it always would. The work kept it at bay during the day, but when the light failed and they sat in the kitchen with the lamp between them, the absence of their husbands settled into the room like a presence of its own. Sarah would find herself reaching for something to show Daniel some small structural problem she had solved before remembering he was not there to show. Emma hummed songs Thomas had taught her, then stopped halfway through when she realized what she was doing. They did not talk about it much. Sarah, because talking about grief felt like indulging it, and she had never been good at indulgence. Emma, because she had cried all her tears in December and had none left for casual evening sadness. Instead, they worked. Sarah built a better watering system. Emma started a second round of lettuce. They fell into bed exhausted each night and woke before dawn to do it again. On the 9th of August, Sarah went down to the spring chamber to check the flow rate and found water pooled on the floor near the east wall where it should not be. She knelt, touched the stone, felt dampness spreading from a crack in one of the pipe channels. The crack was small, hairline, barely visible unless you were looking for it. But water was patient and stone was not, and small cracks had a way of becoming large ones if left alone. She went back up for the lantern, and her tools came down again and examined the pipe more carefully. The crack ran diagonally across a joint, the clay, there darker than the surrounding material, slightly swollen. A firing fault, she suspected something in the original clay that had been waiting decades to fail. Crane had built these pipes himself, mixed the clay, and shaped it, and fired it in some kiln he must have constructed for the purpose. Remarkable that they had lasted this long. Remarkable that they were failing now, when failure meant the difference between keeping the house and losing it. She sat in the passage for a long time with the broken section in her hands, the weight of it familiar and foreign at once. The pipe was faucet clay sealed with a lime and fiber compound she did not have the exact formula for. She could see where Crane had built each section, the careful overlapping collars, the way each length nestled into the next. He had made this the same way he had made everything here, with patience and intention, believing it would matter to someone eventually. She thought about Daniel, who would have said that a broken thing was just an unfinished repair. That had been his way, steady and unalarmed, treating problems as puzzles that required solving rather than disasters that required mourning. She thought about Emma upstairs, not calling down to her, understanding that Sarah needed space to sit with this before she could stand up and face it. She thought about Aldous Crane, who had written instructions for someone he would never meet, who had sealed seeds for years in the hope they would find their way to the right hands. When she came up from the passage, Emma was at the kitchen table with the second journal open. Sarah set the broken pipe section on the table between them. Emma looked at it, then at Sarah's face. How bad? Bad enough, Sarah said. The room will start losing heat within a week. Without heat, the plants will not survive a September cold snap, let alone winter. Emma turned back to the journal, her finger already moving down a page she had marked with cloth. There has to be something in here. Crane would not build a system this complex without noting how to repair it. They found it at 2 in the morning. Emma's eyes burning from reading by lamplight, Sarah's head aching from trying to decipher Crane's handwriting in the margins of pages about heat retention. 1 part white lime, 2 parts river, clay, horsehair binding set wet, and allowed to cure 48 hours before heat application. Emma read it aloud twice to make sure she had it right. Sarah wrote it down in her ledger, her handwriting shaky from exhaustion. We have lime. We have access to river clay at the creek. Where do we get horsehair? Emma closed the journal, rubbed her eyes. Hester has horses. So does Wally. I will ask tomorrow. Sarah looked at the broken section, still sitting on the table. 48 hours to cure. We do not have 48 hours. We have whatever time it takes for the crack to spread, Emma said. Which could be tomorrow or it could be next week. We will not know until it happens. Then we work fast, Sarah replied, and Hope Crane knew what he was talking about. They pulled the broken section out on the morning of the 12th. It came free more easily than Sarah had expected, the collar fittings loose enough to suggest they had been compromised longer than she realized. The fracture ran clean through at a diagonal, the edges rough, where the clay had finally surrendered. She examined it in the lamplight, trying to understand if there had been something she could have done to prevent this, some sign she had missed. The pipe had simply reached the end of what it could hold. Things reach their limit. That is the nature of things. Emma returned from Hester's place that afternoon with a canvas bag full of horsehair, coarse black strands that smelled of barn and dust. Hester sent more than we need. Said if we are doing what she thinks we are doing, we should have extra. Sarah took the bag, felt the weight of it. What does she think we are doing, trying to save something worth saving? Emma said. They mixed the compound that afternoon, working in the spring chamber, where the light was better and the temperature steady. Sarah measured the lime and clay in careful proportions. Emma added water in small amounts until the mixture reached the right consistency. Thick, smooth, workable. The horsehair went in last, stirred through the compound until it disappeared into the clay matrix. Sarah worked it with her hands, feeling it come together the way Crane's notes had promised it would. The color deepened. It held a groove. It did not crack when pressed. Forming the replacement section took 3 attempts. The first collapsed when Sarah tried to remove it from the mold. The second dried too quickly on one side and cracked. The third held. She packed the compound into the wooden form she had built from scraps, shaped the collar fittings to match Crane's original dimensions, smoothed the surface with a wet cloth. Then she set it in the passage with both lanterns burning close to keep the air dry, and they went upstairs to wait. 48 hours. Emma used the time to write letters. One to Hester thanking her for the horsehair and for connecting them with Holloway. One to Frank Holloway confirming the Saturday delivery schedule and requesting that he send word if his needs changed. One to Clem Aldridge, asking if he knew anyone else who might be interested in winter vegetables. Sarah read them before they went out, changed nothing. Sarah spent the time in her ledger running numbers that had started to look more hopeful than they had in months. If the pipe held, if the plants continued producing, if Holloway kept his word, they would have enough to pay the taxes with close to $100 to spare, enough to get through winter, enough to buy seed for spring planting, enough to stop feeling like they were one bad week away from losing everything. On the morning of the third day, Sarah went down to the passage alone. The new pipe section sat where she had left it, the surface dry and hard to the touch. She ran her hand along the seam at each collar, testing the join. Crane's compound had cured tight and close, seated against the existing pipe at both ends the way a bone knits back together. You could feel the seam if you knew to look for it, but the structure was sound. She connected the collar fittings, sealed the joints with a thin second application of the compound, and sat back on her heels. The passage was quiet except for the murmur of the spring, the sound of it filling the space the way it must have filled the same space when Crane worked down here, mixing clay and building pipes and believing that someone would finish what he started. Thank you, she said aloud, her voice strange in the stone chamber. Then she went upstairs and told Emma the pipe was repaired. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, her lips moving without sound. When she opened them again, her expression was calm. How long before we know if it holds 24 hours, Sarah said. We will heat it slowly, watch for leaks. If it holds under pressure for a day, it will hold. And if it does not, then we have learned that Crane's formula works, but my execution does not, Sarah said, and we try again. The pipe held. By the following Saturday, heat was running through the floor of the glass room again. The tomato plants, which had begun to show the first signs of stress during the cool nights, straightened back toward the light. The beans had not lost a single leaf. Sarah checked the floor temperature 3 times that day, found it steady at 67 degrees. Emma harvested 42 pounds of tomatoes and packed them in the crates Holloway had sent up with instructions for proper handling. When Holloway's wagon arrived that afternoon, driven by a young man who introduced himself as Marcus, and did not waste time on small talk, Emma and Sarah carried the crates out together. Marcus examined the tomatoes with the same careful attention Holloway had shown, checking for bruising, testing firmness. He counted out $63 in cash, handed it to Sarah, and loaded the crates. Next week, same time. Sarah folded the bills carefully, put them in her pocket. Next week. After the wagon left, Emma sat on the porch steps and looked at the glass room gleaming in the afternoon sun. We did it? Sarah sat beside her. We did it once. Emma leaned against her shoulder. That is more than we had done before. September arrived with cold mornings and warm afternoons. The kind of weather that made people in Dry Creek start thinking about winter preparations. Sarah and Emma prepared differently, banking on warmth instead of bracing for cold. The glass room held steady, the spring beneath it, indifferent to the fact that frost was starting to silver the grass some mornings. Inside, the tomatoes continued to ripen as if the calendar meant nothing. Vernon Cass came back on the 8th. This time he did not bother with pleasantries. I heard Holloway is buying from you. Sarah stood in the doorway, did not invite him in. He is. Cass's face had gone a darker shade of red. You said you were not planning to compete. We are not competing with you, Mr. Cass. We are selling to a buyer who came to us. That is not the same thing. Cass shifted his weight, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. You are taking business that should be mine. Emma appeared behind Sarah. Mr. Holloway was never your business. He came looking for something you could not provide. Fresh produce grown locally available year-round. You buy from Denver and mark it up. We grow here and sell direct. Those are not the same service. Cass pointed a finger at her. You think you are clever, but you do not understand how things work here. I have friends on the county board. The back taxes on this place are a fragile arrangement. One word from the right person, and they could review that assessment again, maybe find some reasons why it needs to go even higher. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach, but her voice stayed level. Are you threatening us, Mr. Cass? I am explaining how things work, Cass said. You would do well to remember that Dry Creek is a small town, and small towns have long memories. Maybe you should think about whether making an enemy of me is worth whatever Holloway is paying you. After he left, Sarah stood on the porch watching the dust settle. Emma came to stand beside her. He is a frightened man. He is a dangerous man, Sarah corrected. There is a difference. Emma shook her head. He is both. His whole business depends on being the only source, and we just proved there is another way. He is not wrong to be worried. He is just wrong about what to do about it. Sarah looked at her. And what would you do about it? Emma thought for a moment. I would invite him to see what we built. Show him that we are not trying to destroy his business, just create our own. Maybe offer to sell him some of our seeds, help him start his own winter operation. Turn him from an enemy into a partner. Sarah studied her sister's face, reading it the way you can only read a face you have known your whole life. You think that would work? I think it is worth trying, Emma said, because the alternative is fighting him, and we do not have the resources for that. But we do have something he wants, access to what Crane built. If we share that instead of hoarding it, we might find he is more reasonable than he seems. The harvest continued through September at a pace that required both of them working full days. Sarah built additional drying racks for beans. Emma started a third planting of lettuce in the beds where the early crops had finished. The money accumulated in Sarah's lockbox counted and recounted each Saturday's delivery, bringing them closer to the number they needed. By the end of the month, they had $280, 60 short of the tax bill, but with 4 weeks still to go. On the morning of October 1st, Sarah woke to find frost on the windows and the air outside sharp enough to sting. She dressed quickly, went down to check the glass room, found it holding steady at 66 degrees. Outside, the world was going white and silver. Inside, the tomatoes hung heavy and red, oblivious to the fact that everything around them was dying back for winter. She stood in the center of the room, feeling the warmth rise from the floor, and allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. Crane had been right about everything. The spring, the pipes, the glass, the seeds. All of it worked exactly as he had said it would. Emma found her there standing among the plants with her hand on one of the tomato vines. "It is working," Sarah nodded. "It is working." Emma moved to stand beside her. Thomas would have loved this. Daniel, too. They would have Sarah agreed. They would have been down here every morning, checking on things, making improvements, finding new ways to optimize the system. Emma smiled, though her eyes were bright. They would have driven us crazy with their ideas. Probably, Sarah said, but they would have been right about most of them. The moment passed. They harvested 53 pounds that morning, packed them carefully, loaded them onto the wagon. Marcus would collect that afternoon. The routine had become familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. Pick, pack, wait for the wagon count, the money start again. Sarah had learned to trust it in a way she did not trust many things, this cycle of growth and harvest that seemed divorced from the normal rules of seasons. Hester came up on the 4th with news. 3 women from town had been asking about the glass room, wanting to know if Sarah and Emma would teach them how to build one. Apparently, word had spread about the winter tomatoes, and people were starting to think about what else might be possible. Hester sat at the kitchen table with coffee, her expression carefully neutral. "I did not tell them anything specific, just said you might be willing to talk about it. Figured you should decide how much you want to share." Emma looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at the second journal still sitting on the shelf above the kitchen window, alongside the first and third. Crane built this to be shared. If he wanted it secret, he would not have left instructions. Emma nodded. "Then we share it, but not for free. We sell the seeds offered to consult on the building process. Make it worth our time." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "You are starting to think like a businesswoman." "I am starting to think like someone who needs to eat through winter," Emma corrected. By mid-October, they had 4 consultations scheduled and had sold 18 jars of seeds at $2 each. The taxes were paid on the 20th, Sarah walking into the county office with $340 in cash and walking out with a receipt that made the house legally theirs. Emma waited on the wagon, saw Sarah's face when she came out, and did not need to ask. They drove home in comfortable silence, the weight of the last 6 months finally lifting enough that they could breathe without the constant pressure of maybe losing everything. Vernon Cass did not come back, but Wally Pruitt, who apparently spent more time wandering than his mother knew, reported seeing Cass talking to the county assessor in town. "Just talking," Wally said, "but it looked serious." Sarah thanked him for the information, sent him home with a jar of tomatoes for Hester. After he left, Emma asked what Sarah thought it meant. "It means Cass has not given up," Sarah said. "It means we need to be careful." The first snow came on November 3rd, 6 days after the ridge usually saw it, and when it came with conviction. Sarah woke to silence, the particular quality of quiet that only happens when the world is blanketed in white. She dressed in the dark, went down to check the glass room before the sun was up, found it holding at 68 degrees despite the temperature outside having dropped to 18 overnight. The tomato plants stood green and defiant against the white world visible through the glass, their fruit still ripening, as if winter were a rumor they had chosen not to believe. Emma came down an hour later with bread and coffee, stood beside Sarah watching the snow fall. "This is what Crane promised." Sarah took the coffee, wrapped her hands around the warmth of it. "This is what Crane proved possible. The distinction matters." Emma smiled. "To us, maybe. To the plants, I think they just grow." Marcus arrived that afternoon with a wagon equipped with runners instead of wheels, his horses stepping carefully through snow that was already 6 inches deep and still falling. He loaded the crates without comment, counted out the money, and handed Sarah an envelope along with the cash from Mr. Holloway. Sarah opened it, read quickly. Holloway wanted to double his order starting in December. The Mountain View was hosting a winter exhibition for visiting dignitaries, and he needed fresh vegetables to prove Colorado was more than mining towns and frozen wasteland. He was willing to pay $2 a pound for tomatoes, $2.50 for beans. Emma read over Sarah's shoulder. That is $400 a month if we can meet it, can we? Sarah looked at the glass room doing the calculations. We would need to add more plants. Another 6 tomato, maybe 4 more bean. That means more soil, more stakes, more intensive watering. But yes, we can do it. Then we should, Emma said, because 400 a month means we can start planning past winter. Means we can think about spring with money in reserve instead of hoping we make it through. The letter from the county arrived on November 7th, delivered by the same writer who had brought the tax reassessment in June. Sarah opened it standing in the kitchen, her stomach tightening before she even unfolded the paper. The county board had received concerns about unpermitted construction on the Briar Ridge property. An inspection was being scheduled for November 15th to assess compliance with county building codes and safety regulations. Property owners were required to be present and to provide access to all structures. Emma read it twice. Vernon Cass, has to be Sarah confirmed. The timing is too convenient. He waits until after we pay the taxes so we cannot be accused of non-payment, then comes at us from a different angle. Emma set the letter down. What happens if we fail the inspection? Sarah had already been thinking about that. Best case, they fine us and require modifications. Worst case, they condemn the structure and order it torn down. In the middle case, we spend money we do not have fighting this, and it does not matter whether we win or lose, because the fight itself costs more than we can afford. Wally Pruitt appeared at the door on the morning of the 9th, out of breath from running the 3 miles from his mother's place. His face was red with cold and exertion, his words coming fast. My ma sent me. She heard something in town. The county inspector coming, dear. He is a man named Dalton, Margaret Dalton's son. He is the one doing the inspection. Sarah invited him in, gave him water while he caught his breath. Who is Margaret Dalton? Wally drank, wiped his mouth. Old lady lives on the south end of town. Been there forever. Her father knew Aldous Crane back when Crane was still alive. Ma thought you should know. Thought maybe it matters. Sarah looked at Emma. It might. If Dalton's mother knew Crane, she might know about the spring, about what he was trying to build. That could work for us or against us, Emma replied. Depends on whether she thinks we are honoring his work or desecrating it. Emma made the ride to town that afternoon, came back 3 hours later with snow in her hair and a carefully neutral expression. Margaret Dalton was 78 years old, living in a small house that smelled of cedar, osier, and old books. She had served tea and listened while Emma explained about finding the chamber, the seeds, the journals. She had asked careful questions and offered no opinions until Emma finished. Then she had been quiet for a long time before speaking. My father told me about Aldous Crane. Margaret had said, her voice thin but steady, said Crane was a man ahead of his time. Built things that should not have worked, but did understood the land in a way most settlers never bothered to learn. When Crane died, my father said it was a shame because the world had lost someone who saw possibilities where others saw limitations. Emma had waited. Margaret had poured more tea. My son is a good man, but he follows rules. That is his nature. If you want him to see what you built as something worth preserving, you need to show him it is not just functional. You need to show him it is Crane's legacy, finished by people who understand what he was trying to do. Sarah listened to Emma's account, her mind already working through what it meant. An inspection is pass or fail. Either we meet code or we do not. Margaret is suggesting we turn it into something else. Into a judgment about whether we are worthy of Crane's work, Emma said, which is subjective, harder to argue against, but also harder to defend if it goes badly. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then we make sure it does not go badly. We invite people to see what we have done. Not just Dalton, but the whole town. Show them the glass room in winter, the plants growing when everything else is dead. make it impossible for them to condemn it without condemning the idea of it. The invitations went out on the 10th. 40 letters handwritten by Emma, each one addressed to specific families in Dry Creek. Not a request for approval, just an invitation to witness what Aldous Crane had envisioned and what Sarah and Emma had completed. A celebration of winter harvest scheduled for the 15th, the same day as the inspection. Come see what is possible when the past and present work together. 28 families responded yes. 6 responded no. 6 did not respond at all. Sarah marked each response in her ledger, calculated how many people they would need to accommodate how much food to prepare. Emma harvested tomatoes and beans, made plans for how to present them, not just as vegetables, but as proof. Evidence that Crane had been right about everything he had written in those journals. Vernon Cass did not receive an invitation, but he came anyway. Arrived on the morning of the 14th, his wagon loaded with supplies, his expression somewhere between angry and resigned. He climbed down, stood in the cold looking at the glass room. Sarah came out to meet him. Emma stayed in the doorway watching. Cass removed his hat, held it against his chest. I heard you are having some kind of gathering tomorrow. Word travels, Sarah replied, her voice giving nothing. Cass looked at his hat, turned it in his hands. I may have spoken to the county about the inspection, may have mentioned concerns about safety, about structures built without proper oversight. Sarah waited. He looked up, met her eyes. I was wrong to do that. Was angry about losing business, about change I did not ask for and do not know how to handle. That does not make what I did right. Emma came down from the porch, stood beside Sarah. What made you change your mind, Mr. Cass? He looked at her. Talk to Margaret Dalton. She reminded me that her father used to say the only thing worse than change is the stubborn refusal to see its value. Made me think about what I was fighting and why. He gestured at the glass room. I still do not like that you are competing with me, but I also cannot deny that what you have done here is remarkable, and tearing it down out of spite would make me the kind of man I do not want to be. He reached into his wagon, pulled out a crate, brought you some things, candles, lamp oil, sugar. Figured if you are feeding half the town tomorrow, you could use supplies. Sarah took the crate, felt the weight of it. This is generous. Cass put his hat back on. It is an apology, not asking you to forgive me, just asking you to let me try to do better. Emma smiled. Come tomorrow, see what Crane built. Maybe we can talk about how you might build something similar. The 15th arrived clear and cold, the kind of November day that made the sky look hard as glass and the snow sparkle like something precious. People started arriving at noon, wagons and horses making careful progress up the track that Sarah and Emma had spent the previous day clearing. Hester and Wally came first, bringing fresh bread and a jar of preserves. Then came the others. Families Sarah recognized from supply runs to town neighbors she had not known existed until they appeared in her kitchen with food and curiosity in equal measure. Margaret Dalton arrived at 1, driven by her son Robert, the county inspector, who had triggered this whole gathering. She was smaller than Sarah had expected from Emma's description, bent with age, but moving with the deliberate care of someone who refused to let years dictate capability. Robert helped her down from the wagon, his expression professionally neutral in a way that suggested he was working hard to maintain it. Emma greeted them at the door, led them through the kitchen where other guests had already gathered, and out to the glass room. The space was warm, almost uncomfortably, so with 30 people crowded inside, but no one complained. They stood among the tomato plants and bean vines, touching leaves, examining fruit, their breath not fogging in air that had no business being this warm in mid-November. Margaret Dalton moved slowly through the rows, her hand trailing along a tomato vine heavy with fruit. Robert followed his inspector's eye, taking in the structure, the pipes, the careful arrangement of beds and stakes. Sarah stood near the door watching faces. Some showed simple wonder. Others showed the calculation of people thinking about what this meant, what it could mean, what they might be able to do with similar knowledge. Vernon Cass stood in the back quiet, his expression hard to read. Beside him, Frank Holloway examined a tomato still on the vine, his professional assessment evident in the way he tested firmness, checked color. Margaret reached the north wall, turned to face the gathered crowd. Her voice was thin, but carried in the warm space. My father knew Aldous Crane, knew him as a man who believed impossible things could become real if you understood the systems that govern them. Crane studied this land, learned its secrets, and built something that worked with those secrets rather than against them. The room fell quieter. When Crane died, he left instructions, not commands, but invitations, for someone to finish what he started to prove that his ideas could outlive him. She looked at Sarah and Emma. These women found those instructions. They read them, understood them, and had the courage to act on them. What you see here is not just a glass room. It is a completed promise. It is proof that the best ideas do not die with their creators if someone is willing to carry them forward. She paused, her gaze moving to her son. That is worth preserving. That is worth protecting. Robert Dalton stepped forward in his inspector's clipboard in hand. He had been making notes throughout, Sarah noticed. Careful documentation of dimensions, materials, structural elements. Now he looked at those notes, then at the room around him, then at his mother. From a code perspective, the structure is sound. The foundation is stone properly set. The frame is dimensional lumber well joined. The glass is secured and sealed. The heating system is innovative but functional with no evident safety concerns. He looked at Sarah. The only issue is the lack of permit, which is a procedural matter rather than a structural one. Sarah felt something unclench in her chest. And the resolution for that, Robert made another note on his clipboard. Retroactive permitting. You file the paperwork, pay the fee, and the structure is recognized as a legal improvement to the property, assuming no one has objections. He looked around the room. Anyone here have objections to this structure remaining in place? Silence. Then Vernon Cass spoke from the back. No objections, just a question. He moved forward slightly. You said the heating system is innovative. Does that mean it could be replicated? Robert looked at Sarah. That would depend on whether the property owners are willing to share the specifications. Sarah looked at Emma. Emma nodded. We are willing, Sarah confirmed. Aldous Crane left instructions for anyone who wanted to learn. We will do the same. The gathering shifted after that became less formal. People broke into smaller groups, some staying in the glass room to examine the plants more closely, others moving back to the kitchen where Emma had laid out food. Tomatoes sliced and salted, beans cooked with butter and herbs, bread from Hester preserves from 3 different families, coffee strong enough to strip paint. The kind of meal that happens when a community decides to acknowledge something worth acknowledging. Margaret Dalton sat at the kitchen table with the third journal open in front of her, reading Crane's final entry. Sarah sat across from her, watching the old woman's face. You knew him? Not well, Margaret replied. I was 8 when he died, but I remember him at the general store sometimes buying supplies. My father would talk to him about the property, about what Crane was building. I remember my father saying that Crane was trying to bend time, make seasons irrelevant. She looked up from the journal. Looks like he succeeded. Emma brought coffee, sat down beside Sarah. Robert told us the permit fee is $25. Processing takes 2 weeks, but he is willing to expedite given the circumstances. Margaret closed the journal carefully. And after that? After that, the structure is legal, Sarah said. We can continue operating without concern about it being condemned. Margaret nodded. And Crane's work continues. That matters more than people realize. Knowledge that dies unused is just as lost as knowledge never discovered. The guests began leaving as the afternoon light failed each departure, preceded by thanks and questions and promises to return. Hester invited Sarah and Emma to Christmas dinner. 3 different families asked about buying seeds. Vernon Cass lingered near his wagon, clearly wanting to say something, but uncertain how to begin. Emma approached him. You had a question about the heating system. Cass nodded. I have a root cellar. Gets cold in winter, too cold for some vegetables. Been thinking if I could modify it, add warmth somehow, I could extend my own storage and maybe grow a few things. Would you be willing to consult? Emma smiled. For a fee, yes. And in exchange for your help with something else. Cass raised an eyebrow. What kind of help? Next spring, we want to expand the glass room. Add another section, double our growing capacity. We will need someone who knows Denver suppliers can get materials at wholesale. You have those connections. Cass thought about it. You want me to help you grow bigger so you can compete with me more effectively? We want to help you grow bigger too, Emma corrected. Share what we learned from Crane, help you build your own winter operation. Then we are not competing. We are both serving a market that is bigger than either of us realized existed. Cass extended his hand. That is a deal I can accept. They shook. Sarah watched from the porch, allowed herself to feel something close to satisfaction. Problems turning into partnerships. Threats converting to opportunities. The kind of transformation that happened when people stopped fighting and started building instead. Robert Dalton was the last to leave, helping his mother into the wagon with careful attention. Before he climbed up himself, he handed Sarah a folder. The permit application already filled out. You just need to sign and submit with the fee. I expedited the approval, should be official by the end of the month. Sarah took the folder. Thank you. For coming, for seeing what this is, rather than just what it looks like on paper. Robert glanced back at the glass room visible through the kitchen window, warm and lit against the darkening evening. My mother was right. This is worth preserving, not just the structure, but the idea behind it. That the past has things to teach us if we are willing to listen. After everyone left, Sarah and Emma sat in the glass room as the evening settled in. The tomato plants threw long shadows in the lamplight. The beans climbed their trellis into darkness above. Outside, the temperature was dropping towards single digits. Inside, the warmth held steady, the spring beneath them murmuring its constant note. Emma leaned against Sarah's shoulder. We did it. We finished what Crane started, proved his system works, and kept the house. Sarah nodded. We did more than that. We turned doubt into belief. Showed a whole town that the word impossible just means no one has figured it out yet. December brought cold that made November look mild by comparison. Temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time, the kind of cold that cracked wood and froze metal and made breathing feel like swallowing knives. Inside the glass room, the tomatoes continued ripening. Sarah added 2 more plants from seedlings Emma had started in October, expanded the watering system, built additional trellises. The room was becoming crowded, the plants competing for light and space, but they managed. They always managed. Holloway's doubled order meant more work, but also more money. Sarah counted it carefully each week, watched the numbers in her ledger climb past anything she had allowed herself to hope for. By mid-December, they had $800 in reserve, enough to expand the glass room in spring, enough to buy proper tools instead of making do with salvaged ones, enough to hire help if they needed it, though neither of them were quite ready to trust anyone else with Crane's system. The consultations continued. Sarah taught 3 families how to assess their properties for spring potential, how to measure flow rates, and test soil temperatures. Emma sold 62 jars of seeds in December alone, each sale accompanied by careful instructions on planting and care. Crane's legacy spreading through the valley, one household at a time, each new glass room, a small act of defiance against winter's claim on growing things. On the 18th, a letter arrived from Pennsylvania. The return address was unfamiliar, the handwriting careful and old-fashioned. Sarah opened it at the kitchen table, Emma reading over her shoulder. The letter was from a woman named Clara Whitmore, who identified herself as Aldous Crane's niece. She had heard through correspondence with Margaret Dalton about the completion of her uncle's glass room, about the seeds that had been preserved and were now growing again. She was writing to express her gratitude and to share something she thought Sarah and Emma should know. When Uncle Aldous died, Clara wrote he left a small inheritance to be held in trust for whoever completed his work. He was specific in his will. The money was not to go to family, but to the people who proved his ideas could outlive him. My father, his brother, thought he was being foolish, but Uncle Aldous insisted. He knew what mattered was not the structure itself, but who would carry it forward. The inheritance was $300 held in a Philadelphia bank for 11 years, accruing modest interest. The current value was $412. Clara had enclosed the bank information and instructions for transfer. The money was there, she wrote, with Uncle Aldous' blessing from beyond. Used it to continue his work, prove that his faith in the future was justified. Emma set the letter down, her hands shaking slightly. $412, on top of what we already have. Sarah did the arithmetic automatically. $1,200 total, enough to double the glass room buy materials for a proper greenhouse, maybe even purchase the adjacent property if it ever came available. Emma's voice was quiet. He believed in us before we existed. Built all of this hoping someone would find it and care enough to finish it. And he set aside money to help them when they did. Sarah folded the letter carefully. He knew that ideas matter only as much as the people willing to work for them. That is what we are doing, working for something bigger than ourselves. Emma nodded. And someday someone will work for what we are building now. That is how things that matter stay alive. January arrived with a storm that buried the valley in 3 feet of snow and kept Sarah and Emma housebound for 4 days. They used the time to plan the spring expansion sketching designs that incorporated Crane's principles, but adapted them for larger scale. Sarah calculated materials needed, estimated costs, made lists of suppliers Vernon Cass had connected them with. Emma cataloged the remaining seeds, determined which varieties to propagate for wider distribution, which to keep for their own use. On the 3rd day of being snowed in, they received an unexpected visitor. Wally Pruitt arrived on snowshoes, having walked the 3 miles from his mother's place through drifts that came up to his chest in places. He was carrying a letter, his face red from cold and exertion. My ma said this was important enough to get to you right away, even in this weather. Sarah took the letter and invited him in. Emma made hot coffee while Sarah read. The letter was from the Territorial Agricultural Office in Denver. They had received reports about innovative winter growing methods being employed at Briar Ridge. The Territorial Commissioner was interested in visiting in February to assess the potential for broader application of these techniques. If the methods prove scalable, the Territory might be willing to provide funding for research and development, potentially establishing Briar Ridge as a demonstration site for advanced agricultural practices. Sarah looked up from the letter. They want to make us an official research site. Emma's eyes widened. With funding, Sarah scanned the letter again. Potentially, they mentioned grants for expansion, stipends for documentation and teaching, possible connection with the agricultural college being established in Fort Collins. Wally sipped his coffee. Is that good, Sarah? And Emma looked at each other. That is very good, Emma confirmed. That is Crane's work being recognized not just as clever, but as important, as something that could change how people grow food in difficult climates. The commissioner arrived on February 11th with 2 assistants and a photographer. They spent 3 days at Briar Ridge measuring and documenting everything: the glass room, the spring chamber, the pipe system, the seed storage. They interviewed Sarah, and Emma took detailed notes on Crane's journals, photographed the tomato plants, heavy with fruit, while snow lay thick outside. The commissioner, a serious man named Patterson with steel gray hair and careful eyes, asked questions that proved he understood what he was looking at. On the final day, he sat at the kitchen table with his notes spread out, Sarah and Emma across from him. What you have accomplished here is significant, not just impressive, but scientifically important. The spring heating system alone would be worth study, but combined with Crane's preservation methods and your own agricultural management, this represents a complete rethinking of how we approach year-round food production in challenging climates. He pulled out a folder. The Territory is prepared to offer funding in the amount of $600 annually for 3 years, renewable based on results. In exchange, you would be required to document your methods thoroughly, allow periodic inspections, and provide training to interested parties at least twice annually. Additionally, we would establish this site as the Crane Agricultural Research Station with formal recognition of Aldous Crane's original work. Sarah felt Emma's hand find hers under the table. That is more than generous. Patterson smiled slightly. That is investment in the future. Your future, the Territory's future, and the future of everyone who struggles to grow food when the climate says they cannot. March brought the kind of warmth that made winter feel like a bad dream fading upon waking. The snow receded in patches, revealing brown grass and mud, and the tentative promise that spring would actually arrive eventually. Sarah and Emma began construction on the expansion, doubling the size of the glass room, adding a second chamber for seed storage and a small workshop for starting seedlings. Vernon Cass proved invaluable securing materials at wholesale and even sending two of his own workers to help with the heavy lifting. The first training class happened in April's 12 families arriving to learn Crane's methods. Sarah taught the technical aspects, the engineering and mathematics of heat flow and temperature management. Emma taught the agricultural side, the seed selection, implanting schedules, and care requirements. They used Crane's journals as textbooks, his notes as gospel. By the end of the week, each family left with knowledge seeds and careful plans for implementing similar systems on their own properties. Wally Pruitt asked if he could apprentice work with Sarah and Emma full-time to learn everything they knew about Crane's system. Hester brought the request herself, her son standing beside her, with the kind of hope that comes from finding something you want to dedicate yourself to. We would pay, of course, and he would work hard. You know he would work hard. Sarah looked at Wally, saw something in his face that reminded her of how she had felt reading Crane's journals for the first time. The sense of discovering something worth learning. Yes, she said, he can start Monday. By May, there were 8 glass rooms operating in the valley, each one a variation on Crane's design, each one producing vegetables that defied seasonal expectations. Sarah received letters from as far as Montana asking about the methods, about whether the system could work in different climates with different crops. She answered each one carefully, honestly explaining what worked and what did not, never promising more than the data supported. Emma continued adding to the third journal, documenting everything they learned, every modification they made, every success and failure. Her entries filled the remaining pages Crane had left empty, her handwriting smaller than his but just as careful. She wrote as if writing for people who would read this decades from now, the same way Crane had written for them. The knowledge building on itself, each generation adding to what came before. On a warm evening in late May, Sarah and Emma sat on the porch watching the sun set over the ridge. The glass room stood to their right, catching the last light, glowing like something built from captured warmth. The valley below was going green, the aspen leafing out the meadows, filling with wildflowers. It has been more than a year, Emma said. Since we came here, since we decided to stay. Sarah nodded. Since we decided to build something instead of just surviving. Summer arrived with heat that tested even the glass room's ability to manage temperature. Sarah installed a ventilation system, canvas panels that could be opened when the internal temperature exceeded 80 degrees. Emma planted heat-tolerant varieties, experimented with shade cloth, learned what would and would not thrive in the peculiar microclimate they had created. The spring continued its steady flow, indifferent to seasons, providing the baseline warmth that made everything else possible. Vernon Cass completed his own glassroom in June, a smaller version of Briar Ridge's, but functional. He invited Sarah and Emma to the inaugural planting, asked Emma to bless the seeds before they went into the soil. She did, feeling slightly foolish, but also moved by the gesture. These seeds carry Crane's work forward. Treat them with respect, learn from them, and they will teach you things you did not know were possible. Cass planted the first tomato himself, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the delicate seedling. Thank you, he said to Emma, for sharing this instead of hoarding it, for understanding that some things become more valuable when they are given away. The territorial commissioner returned in August with news. The agricultural college in Fort Collins wanted to offer Sarah and Emma teaching positions part-time, instructing in advanced growing methods. The salary was modest, but the prestige was significant. You would be the first women on faculty, Patterson said. The first instructors without formal degrees. But your practical knowledge exceeds most theoretical education, and the college recognizes that. Sarah looked at Emma. Emma looked at the glass room, at the valley, at everything they had built here. We would need to stay here, maintain the research station. Of course, Patterson confirmed. You would teach 1 week per month, spend the rest of your time here. It is an honor, Sarah said carefully. But we will need to discuss it. Take your time, Patterson replied. The offer stands as long as you need to consider it. They talked about it for 3 days, weighed the opportunity against the demands, the recognition against the time commitment. In the end, Emma made the decision simple. Crane spent years learning alone. We have a chance to teach dozens, maybe hundreds of people what he discovered. That is how knowledge spreads, how ideas outlive individual lives. We have to say yes. Sarah nodded slowly. Then we say yes. The teaching began in September, 1 week at Fort Collins, showing eager students how temperature differentials and passive heating could transform agriculture. The rest of the month at Briar Ridge, continuing their own work, documenting results, training the steady stream of farmers and gardeners who made the pilgrimage to see Crane's system in operation. The rhythm suited them, the balance between sharing knowledge and generating it. October brought the first anniversary of the dinner, where they had opened the glass room to the town. Margaret Dalton suggested making it an annual tradition. A harvest celebration, she called it. A reminder that determined people can turn doubt into certainty. The gathering happened on October 15th, twice as many people as the previous year. The glass room was filled to capacity, people crowding in to see tomatoes, still ripening beans, still climbing winter vegetables already started for the coming cold months. Margaret stood in the center of the room, her voice stronger than it had been the previous year, as if the work happening here had given her new energy. A year ago, we stood here wondering if this would last, if it was real, or just temporary luck. Now we know. This is real. This is lasting. And it is spreading. She gestured to Vernon Cass. Vernon has his own glass room now. She pointed to 3 other families. So do they. And more are being built. Crane's dream of making seasons irrelevant is becoming reality, one structure at a time. She turned to Sarah and Emma. These women found something precious and chose to share it instead of keeping it to themselves. That choice has changed. This valley changed how we think about what is possible. Next year, there will be more glass rooms. The year after, even more. And all of it traces back to 2 widows who refused to accept that their only choices were to leave or to struggle. They found a third option. They built it. The gathering became a celebration, impromptu and joyful. Someone brought a fiddle. Dancing happened in the space between the plant beds, careful not to disturb the tomatoes, but not careful enough to avoid jostling the beans. Laughter filled the warm space, music carried through glass into the cold October night. Sarah stood in the doorway watching, feeling something she had not felt since before Daniel died. Not happiness exactly, but satisfaction. The deep kind that comes from building something that matters and seeing it recognized. Emma found her there, handed her a cup of cider. We finished what someone else started. Sarah took the cup. We built forward from what was left behind. That is how important things survive. Emma smiled, not by being preserved unchanged, but by being used and improved and given to the next people who need them. Winter came again, the second winter at Briar Ridge, and it came with the confidence that comes from having survived once. The glass room held against temperatures that dropped to 15 below zero. The spring continued its steady warmth. The tomatoes grew, the beans climbed the lettuce-filled beds in tight green rows. Sarah taught classes at Fort Collins. Emma documented results in the journals Wally learned with the intensity of someone who had found his calling. On a February evening, cold and clear, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open. The numbers told a story of transformation. $1,200 saved, $800 in annual funding from the territory, $600 from teaching, regular income from produce sales. They were not wealthy, but they were secure in a way that had seemed impossible when they first climbed down from the wagon and looked at the ruined house waiting for them. Emma came in from the glass room with frost in her hair and warmth on her face. The tomatoes are setting fruit early this year. We might have ripe ones by March, Sarah smiled. Crane would have been pleased to see how far his work has traveled. Emma sat down across from her. Do you ever think about what would have happened if we had not found the chamber, if we had just fixed the house and tried to make do without Crane's gift? Sarah closed the ledger. We would have survived. We always do. But we would not have built anything worth remembering. She looked at the journals on the shelf, 3 volumes that had guided them through impossible things and made them real. We found something someone left for us, learned from it, and turned it into something we could pass forward. That is the only way important things survive. Not by being preserved unchanged, but by being used and improved and given to the next people who need them. Emma nodded, and someday someone will read what I wrote in that third journal and use it to build something we cannot imagine. Sarah met her sister's eyes. Then we should make sure what we write is worth reading. The spring of their second year brought expansion beyond what they had initially planned. The territorial funding allowed for a proper greenhouse larger than the original glass room, with mechanized ventilation and an improved heating system based on Crane's principles, but refined through trial and error. Wally oversaw much of the construction, his apprenticeship having turned him into someone who understood not just how to follow plans, but how to improve them. By May, the Crane Agricultural Research Station was producing enough vegetables to supply 3 hotels in Leadville and Denver, with interest from restaurants as far as Cheyenne. Sarah managed the business side with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. Emma managed the agricultural side with creativity that constantly found new applications for Crane's core insights. Together, they built something that honored the past while creating a future neither of them had dared imagine. On a June evening, warm and long, they sat in the original glass room after everyone had gone home. The space was quieter now, used more for seed starting and experimentation than production. The tomato plants that had seemed so miraculous 2 years ago were now routine, expected normal. Progress had made the impossible ordinary, which was perhaps the greatest tribute to Crane's work. Emma opened the third journal, looked at the entries she had made. Hundreds of pages now filled with observations and modifications and careful documentation. I think this is full. We need to start a fourth. Sarah looked at the shelf where the 3 original volumes stood. We need to start several fourths, one for pure research, one for business operations, one for teaching methods. Keep them separate so the knowledge stays organized. Emma smiled. You are thinking about people reading these 100 years from now. Is that foolish? Sarah shook her head. Crane thought about us reading his work 11 years later. 100 years is just 11 years stretched longer. If what we are doing matters, it will matter then too. They sat in the warmth, listening to the spring murmur beneath them, feeling the weight of everything that had brought them here. 2 widows who had refused to accept limitations. A dead man's incomplete dream. Seeds that waited in darkness until someone cared enough to plant them. All of it coming together into something neither past nor present alone could have created. Something that would outlive all of them if they did the work of writing it down, teaching it forward, trusting that the future would care as much as they did. Christmas came quietly. They spent it alone by choice, cooking a small meal from vegetables grown in impossible warmth while snow piled against the windows. They talked about the next expansion, about the possibility of a fourth training session, about letters from Montana and Wyoming asking for consultations. Sarah made lists in her ledger, detailed plans with costs and timelines. Emma read from the journals, marking passages she wanted to remember, adding notes and margins that would outlive her the same way Crane's notes had outlived him. On Christmas evening, Emma opened the third journal to the last page Crane had written. The room is nearly ready. Harriet says, we will plant the first beds by spring. I will finish these notes when... She picked up her pen, dipped it in ink, and wrote below Crane's final line. Mr. Crane, we found your spring. We finished your room. We planted your seeds. They grew just as you said they would. Harriet would be proud. She paused, thinking, then continued. You built this for people you would never meet, trusted us to understand what you were trying to accomplish. That trust was not misplaced. The glass room stands. The seeds grow. Your ideas have outlived you by more than a decade now, and we intend to make sure they outlive us too. We are the ones who came after. We will make sure we are not the last. She signed both their names, set the pen down. Sarah read what she had written, nodded once. That is right. That is exactly right. She reached across the table, took Emma's hand. We are the ones who came after, and we will not be the last. No, Emma agreed. We will make sure of it.